Continuing reading from my theology coursework from 2015. This part is about the Middle Ages, the church in the Middle Ages. This is, I believe this section of the course was going over the history of the Christian church, several volumes written by Schaff that are now public domain, written in the end of the 19th century, I believe. The Middle Ages. Hildebrand wrote to Hugo of Cluny in the year 1075, from Schaff, quote, page 18, "The Eastern Church, fallen from the faith and attacked by the infidels from without, in the west, south, or north, scarcely any bishops who have obtained their office regularly or whose life and conduct correspond to their calling and who are actuated by the love of Christ instead of worldly ambition. Nowhere princes who prefer God's honor to their own and justice to gain. The Romans, Longobards, and Normans among whom I live, as I often told them, are worse than Jews and heathens. And when I look to myself, I feel oppressed by such a burden of sin that no other hope of salvation has left me but in the mercy of Christ alone." End quote. Later in the year 1075, the very popular Hildebrand was made pope. The Middle Ages connect late antiquity to the modern era. Bishop Euliphilus, died 381, invented the Gothic alphabet. Schaff, Volume 4, page 73, as St. Cyril would later invent the Cyrillic. Civilization would expand its range and change its form through Christianity, outgrowing Roman classicism to become Germano-Romanic, Celtic, and Slavic Greek. Beyond the reaches of the ancient Roman Empire in Western Europe, there were other ancient civilizations existing. China, India, and the Americas had religions of various forms that hadn't encountered the Word of God through Moses or Jesus Christ. Civilization founded with the Lord accelerated theological, philosophical, technological, and social development. Mesoamerican civilization failed to invent the wheel, except as a toy, understandably, since they had no horses, until the Spanish arrived. Human sacrifice of prior ruling clans was practiced at Cahokia at St. Louis and of captives in Aztec Mexico, while Polynesians performed great sailing voyages and Dorset Eskimos drove dog teams across the North American Arctic littoral from Siberian to Greenland. In just 200 years, they failed to develop very far scientifically. The intellectual genius of such people is applied to survival, techcraft not uncommonly. Toynbee pointed out that the challenges of civilizations with arrested development are too great. The Chinese, without the Lord, failed to develop a non-imperial egalitarianism politically, as did Europe, easily establishing decentralized and centralized bureaucratic networks of not only royal in various realms, but of churchmen and women as well. Less than ideal and variegated in violence and nonviolent phases of changes, the evolution was comparable to that of any worldly kingdom in levels of violence. Christianity dampened violence from the bottom up rather than the top down. To learn how Europe was prior to Christian missions, one may read Tacitus to learn of German rules of trial and penalties for clubbing someone's skull, for example, with or without breaking it, and if the victim was or wasn't a member of the tribe. More recent studies have found that Celtic tribes sometimes ate their captives and made exterior building ornaments of their skulls and homes, as shown in Swiss archaeological research. G.W.F. Hegel wrote of a thesis in his Phenomenology of Mind of the evolution of spirit as God realizing himself through history and, of course, the universe. That may have been an informative paradigm for the Christian scientist Charles Darwin as well as the political philosopher Karl Marx. Each adapt Hegel's paradigm to his own thesis in interpreting substantive history. One may choose to adapt and employ Hegel's paradigm in a different way, though to describe an omnipotent God pre-existing history and all things that are contingent ideas for God. God is letting man evolve through history. The medieval era of the history of the Christian church was as exciting a period of little less than a millennium in which human society of the West grew with the spiritual leavening of the Spirit of God bringing the nations together from a more primeval time as pagans of the forests. In the preceding pagan era, tribal associations, commonly with war as the basic male occupation, jostled for turf. Protracted war of Germanic tribes against Celts, Slavs to the east, met with Turkic and Mongolian tribes as a precursor to later great conflicts of the invasions of Mongols and Turks from east to west. Several hundred years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Vikings would row and sail around Europe and journey on its rivers to attack various peoples for profit. Christianity would become the spiritual tie that drew and bound the leaders and many of the people of the pagan world together. And I wanted to make a couple of comments about the importance of farming. Farming started, I believe, about 10,000 BC in the Middle East and Asia Minor, and that changed the way people lived considerably, of course, and in Europe. And then there was another small article that I read somewhere that said that until there were a lot of vegetables in the diet, human beings were mostly much darker, that eating vegetables somehow lightened the skin, even of Europeans. That's a strange point, such as by 5,000 or 10,000 BC, I suppose, that I would put into here. Hildebrandian popes. Schaff in the 11th century from V5, quote, "The history of the period begins with a survey of the papacy as the controlling power of Western Christendom. It embraces 6 stages. 1. The Hildebrandian popes, 1049-1073. 2. Gregory, 7. 1073-1085, or the assertion of the supreme authority of the papacy in human affairs. 3. From Gregory's death to the Concordat of Worms, 1122, or the settlement of the controversy over investiture. 4. From the Concordat of Worms to Innocent III, 1198. 5. The pontificate Innocent III, 1198-1216, or the papacy at its height, from Innocent III to Boniface VIII, 1216-1294, or the struggle of the papacy with Frederick II and the restoration of peace between the papacy and the empire. Continuing from Schaff's quoting. The papacy had reached its lowest stage of weakness and degeneracy when at Sutri in 1046, under the influence of Henry III, 2 popes were deposed, and a third was forced to abdicate in the public opinion of Europe. The papacy was still a necessary institution established by Christ, and the primacy of Peter for the government and administration of the church. There was nothing to take its place. It needed only a radical reformation in its head, which would be followed by a reformation of the members. Good men all over Europe anxiously desired and hoped that Providence would intervene and rescue the chair of Peter from the hands of thieves and robbers and turn it once more into a blessing. The idea of abolishing the papacy did not occur to the mind of the Christians of that age as possible or desirable. At last, the providential man for effecting this necessary reformation appeared in the person of Hildebrand, who controlled 5 successive papal administrations for 24 years, 1049-1073, then occupied the papal chair himself for 12 years, 1073-1085, and was followed by like-minded successors. He is one of the greatest, if not the greatest, of popes, and one of the most remarkable men in history. He excited in his age the highest admiration and the bitterest hatred. Opinions about his principles and policy are still divided, but it is impossible to deny his ability, energy, earnestness, and achievements." End quote. The issue of sacerdotal marriage loomed large during the Hildebrandian papacy era. Simony was rampant, as evidently was priests with a concubine or keeping a sub-introducta mulier. Yes, I cited the latter term just to use the term. It would have been interesting if the concept of keeping a sub-introducta mulier had arisen during the late Ken Starr's time as special prosecutor. "Mr. President, do you have a sub-introducta mulier?" Volume 5 from page 1516, quote, "The same Lateran Council of 1059 passed severe laws against the 2 heresies of simony and Nicolaitism. It threatened all priests who were unwilling to give up their wives or concubines with the loss of their benefices and the right of reading Mass, and warned the laity against attending their services. No one, says the 3rd of the 13 canon, shall hear Mass from a priest who to his certain knowledge keeps a concubine or a sub-introducta mulier. These severe measures led to serious disturbances." That was unquote. "These severe measures led to serious disturbances in northern Italy, especially in the Diocese of Milan, where every ecclesiastical office from the lowest to the highest was for sale, and where marriage or concubinage was common among priests of all grades, not excluding the archbishop." 19. Candidates for holy orders of unmarried were asked if they had strength to remain so. This is a continuing quote from Schaff. "If unmarried, were asked if they had strength to remain so. If not, they could be legally married. But second marriages were forbidden, and the Levitical law as to the virginity of the bride was observed. Those who remained single were objects of suspicion, while those who brought up their families in the fear of God were respected and eligible to the episcopate. Concubinage was regarded as a heinous offense and a bar to promotion. 20. But the Roman Church and the Hildebrandian party reversed the case and denounced sacerdotal marriages. as unlawful concubinage. The leader of this party in Lombardy was Anselmo Baggio, west of Milan, a zealous and eloquent young priest who afterward became Bishop of Lucca and then Pope as Alexander II. He attacked the immorality of the clergy and was supported by the lowest populace contemptuously called pateria or paterins, i.e. ragbags, end quote. William the Conqueror fought under a banner blessed by the Pope, Hildebrand, page 16, volume 5, in invading England in 1066. Normans had already repelled the Muslims from Sicily in southern Italy. They were experienced at the art of war and supported the papacy. You know, you would think that Sicily, like some of the ancient Latin pronunciations of things, I believe they use C's as K, pronounce it K, like as Marcus Cicero, Tullius Cicero, and you would think that with a boot there in Italy, at some point Sicily was maybe Kickley. Perhaps not. The Middle Ages became an age of discovery for mankind of his intellectual, social, and physical potential for being better in the image of God. God is pure reason, logic, and love surpassing all human understanding. Bootstrapping any given universe from the inclination of his thought, he donated the impetus and order of assembly of existence for the development of human society during the Middle Ages. God's Mojpank, mind plans, comprising teleology, is marvelous to consider so far as one might make inferences of it. With the presence of the Christian Church and with its monks, priests, and bishops, nations were given spiritual reasons to interact at the highest level of state. War and hostage-taking were basic elements of statecraft before the infusion of the Church into the social order. Yet, of course, with human beings, the agents of socialization, that God employed the problems of sin in the state, people and Christians continued. Development of the nations from the pagan foundations of tribal turf instead of legal boundaries emerged. If kings sometimes donated land to the Church, they sometimes appointed bishops as well, refer to the Merovingian kings. With tens of thousands of Christian prelates involving social positions within ecclesiastical structures, the practical issues of sexuality arise. Paul wrote on celibacy and marriage, yet the worldly challenges of creating uniform rules of conduct for so many people counter to human nature, mankind not being angelic, was an opportunity for corruption to flourish. Schaff, volume 5, page 24, quote, the motives of Gregory and his zeal for sacerdotal celibacy were partly monkish and partly hierarchical. Celibacy was an essential part of his ascetic ideal of a priest of God who must be superior to carnal passions and frailties, wholly devoted to the interests of the Church, distracted by no earthly cares, separated from his fellow men and commanding their reverence by angelic purity. Celibacy, moreover, was an indispensable condition of the freedom of the hierarchy. He declared that he could not free the Church from the rule of the laity unless the priests were freed from their wives. A married clergy is connected with the world by social ties and concern for the support of the family. An unmarried clergy is independent, has no home, and aim but the Church, and protects the Pope like a standing army. Another motive for opposing clerical marriage was to prevent the danger of a hereditary caste which might appropriate ecclesiastical property to private uses and impoverish the Church. The ranks of the hierarchy, even the chair of St. Peter, were to be kept open to self-made men of the humblest classes, but closed against hereditary claimants. This was a practical recognition of the democratic principle in contrast with the aristocratic feudalism of the Middle Ages. And I might interject here, the United States is now developing the problem of concentrated wealth in the United States, affecting things adversely, especially because of the rise of drones, artificial intelligence, and, of course, directed energy weapons, which is sort of a counter-drone technology. However, it is also possible that drones might even be used to bring in all kinds of weapons of mass destruction, such as nerve agents all across the country, fairly easily, actually. I mean, it's much better to have peace now, is the point of what I'm saying. Peace with all the countries of the world, and instead of developing these new radical upgrade of the quality of conventional weapons of mass destruction, catalyzed wars. Hildebrand himself, who rose from the lowest rank without patronage to the papal throne, was the best illustration of his clerical democracy. The power of the confessional, which is one of the pillars of The priesthood came to the aid of celibacy. Women are reluctant to entrust their secrets to a priest who is a husband and father of a family, end quote. It is very challenging to abridge Schaff's work of history, that of the history of the Christian church, even in small portions, for the purpose of illuminating salient features of church history and the sketch of the topic. Schaff's is a great, informative, and entertaining to read work, very well informed and researched, writing before the marvels of 20th century science. He was able to regard history with a more substantive regard for its value. He writes in one place of a joke told him by a local rowing him across Lake Killarney in 1875. American scholarship in history was fairly simple then. One could read what exists in the USA's Ivy League, catch a boat to London, and search for archival sources in Western European centers. Not much research is given on Orthodox areas of Russia or Eastern Europe, yet there is still high-quality history of the West. Schaff evaluates quite well meta roles of the church in relation to society in the West. I cannot copy and paste too much here without redundancy emerging. Schaff mentions that the word dunce was inspired by Duns Scotus, incidentally. This passage is fairly remarkable, though. Schaff, Volume 5, pages 20 to 23, quote, "For William the Conqueror, Gregory expressed great affection, addressing him as best beloved Carissime, but solemnly reminded him that he owed his promotion to the throne of England to the favor of the Roman See, and bidding him to be prompt in the payment of Peter's pence." 46. His predecessors had paid but fealty he refused to pay, as his predecessors had refused to pay it. 47. Unbiblical and intolerable as it is. Hildebrand's scheme of papal absolutism is a theory of abiding validity for the Middle Ages. It was better that the papacy should rule. It was indeed a spiritual despotism, but it checked a military despotism, which was the only alternative and would have been far worse. The Church, after all, represented the moral and intellectual interests over against rude force and passions. She could not discharge her full duty unless she was free and independent. The princes of the Middle Ages were mostly ignorant and licentious despots, while the popes, in their official character, advocated the cause of learning, the sanctity of marriage, and the rights of the people. It was a conflict of moral with physical power, of intelligence with ignorance, of religion with vice. The theocratic system made religion the ruling factor in medieval Europe and gave the Catholic Church an opportunity to do her best. Her influence was, upon the whole, beneficial. The enthusiasm for religion inspired the Crusades, carried Christianity to heathen savages, built the cathedrals and innumerable churches, founded the universities and scholastic theology, multiplied monastic orders and charitable institutions, checked wild passions, softened manners, stimulated discoveries and inventions, preserved ancient classical and Christian literature, and promoted civilization. The papacy struck its roots deep in the past, even as far back as this 2nd century. Unquote. I should make a comment about the Crusades because there are different sensibilities today. But, the Crusades were in reply to the invasion of Spain and Sicily and Turkey by Muslim forces, Abbasid and Umayyad caliphates. And Charles Martel stopped them. And it was a battle for, better part of 500 years to drive them out of Europe. The Crusades were a reaction rather than something else. To start with, although the Jews were banished not only in 70 A.D. from Jerusalem, they were actually banished later from returning to Jerusalem during the Byzantine Empire, I believe it was, at a certain point, like 170 A.D. or something. The Jews have been kicked around a fair amount for quite a while. Anyway, to return to quote, "But it was based in part on pious frauds, the pseudo-Isidorian decretals and the false donation of Constantine. The medieval theodicy was at best a carnal anticipation of the millennial reign, when all the kingdoms of this world shall obey the peaceful scepter of Christ. The papacy degenerated more and more into a worldly institution and an intolerable tyranny over the hearts and minds of men. Human nature is too noble to be ruled by despotism, and too weak to resist its temptations. The state has divine authority as well as the church, and the laity have rights as well as the clergy. These rights came to the front as civilization advanced, and as the hierarchy abused its power. It was the abuse of priestly authority for the enslavement of men, the worldliness of the church, and the degradation and profanation of religion in the traffic of indulgences which provoked the judgment of the Reformation." End quote. The issue of keeping the Christian clergy righteous. Schaff writes, Volume 5, page 24, quote, "The new order owed its whole time to the office and had none left for marriage and family life. Only an unmarried man who refuses to gratify carnal lusts can fulfill the injunction to be a temple of God and avoid quenching the Spirit. These motives controlled also the followers of Gregory and the whole hierarchy and secured the ultimate triumph of sacerdotal celibacy. The question of abolishing it has from time to time been agitated, and in the exceptional cases of the Maronites and United Greeks, the popes have allowed single marriage in deference to old custom and for prudential reasons. Pope Pius II, before he ascended the papal chair, said the good reasons required the prohibition of clerical marriage, but better reasons required its restoration. The hierarchical interest, however, has always overruled these better reasons. Whatever may have been the advantages of clerical celibacy, its evils were much greater. The sexual immorality of the clergy, more than anything else, undermined the respect of the people for the spiritual guides, and was one of the chief causes of the Reformation, which restored honorable clerical marriage, created a pastoral home with its blessings, and established the supremacy of conscience over hierarchical ambition." End quote. What happened after celibacy was enforced with much suffering and even loss of life, Reverend Schaff in the topic, Volume 5, page 25, the enforcement of sacerdotal celibacy. Schaff, Volume 5, page 28, quote, "Concubinage and licentiousness took the place of holy matrimony. The acts of councils abound in complaints of clerical immorality and the vices of unchastity and drunkenness. The records of the Middle Ages are full of the evidences that indiscriminate license of the worst kind prevailed throughout every rank of the hierarchy." 62 of the 10th and 11th centuries, end quote. As the Christian Church developed an ecclesiastical structure and evolved its method, the nations too founded agencies and ideas, doctrines, and procedures for increasing sophistication. The problem in modern third world nation startups of the lack of non-governmental agencies to fill the void as catalysts for social cohesion and public development were mitigated significantly during the Middle Ages in Europe by the progressive advance of structure in and out of the church coinciding with state advance. It is a marvelous subject to consider. Problems with the succession of kings and right to rule internationally were paralleled in the Avignon captivity and subsequent simultaneous existence of three popes. While the controversy on the right of investiture continued, the issue of the right of any pope or patriarch to act as monarch over all Christians, and even the politics of the nations arose. While arguments over doctrine rising to the level of heresy occurred, political theories about the political rights of man to be free from tyranny stirred. The assertions of the right of the laity to select their own leader of the church made at the Council of Constance supported the paradigm of traits toward political independence from imperialism. One could find the development of nationalism, too, in reactions against various formations of political and ecclesiastical imperialism. With Philip Schaff's list of contents of his study of Christian church history published in the late 19th century, it is easy to comprehend the rise of complexity and structure that implicitly occurred socially around the Christian world and beyond. Even the Muslim world was influenced by Christian ethics. It is challenging to imagine Muhammad arising in the absence of the appearance of Jesus Christ the Savior, or even the course of mass social paganism through the same period without a spiritual foundation. Francis of Assisi, in personifying the work of the Lord, is a far cry different than the ethics of tossing deformed babies on the public garbage heap or those stoking up the chemical or biological engines of Holocaust. The Romans used to toss deformed babies on the public garbage heap for anyone to collect that wanted them. Humanity do not all follow the spiritual ethics of the Lord, and some do not know what they are. Reading Schaff's History of the Christian Church, Volume 4, on the Middle Ages, it is possible to get a good idea about the evolution of the ecclesiastical institution. Maybe the church had three primary roles in that 1,000 years: missions, doctrine, ecclesiastical structure, and relation of church and state. It's complex. There were three popes at one time. Then one is aware of the five patriarchates of the ancient era. And one should consider the Council of Constance and where the Catholic Church is today in regard to the bishops and the election of the Pope, especially the new one from Argentina. Schaff has a bibliography that is remarkable. A few writers actually put together a 50-volume history of the Byzantine Empire, complexity yet beautifully illustrating an example of God's role in developing human social infrastructure. And then I will skip along here forward a bit. I believe, here's Schaff's TOC for volumes 4, 5, and 6. I believe that Schaff's slightly modified TOC may be used as a basic outline for the essential salient features of Christian church history during the Middle Ages, a period about 590 AD to 1500 AD, almost 1,000 years. History of the Christian Church, Volume 6. The Middle Ages, AD 1049, 1294. This is his TOC, slightly modified. The Middle Age, limits and general character of the nations of medieval Christianity, the Celtic, Teuton, and the Slav, genius of medieval Christianity, periods of Middle Age, conversion of the northern and western barbarians, character of medieval missions, literature of the Britons, the Anglo-Saxons, the mission of Gregory and Augustine, conversion of Kent, AD 595, 604, 29, antagonism of the Saxon and British clergy, conversion of the other kingdoms of the Heptarchy, conformity to row established, Wilfrid, Theodore, Bede, the conversion of Ireland, St. Patrick and St. Bridget, the Irish Church after St. Patrick, subjection of Ireland to English and Roman rule, the conversion of Scotland, St. Ninian and St. Kentigern, St. Columba and the monastery of Iona, the Chaldees, extinction of the Celtic Church and triumph of Rome under King David, 1. Arian Christianity among the Gauls and other German tribes, conversion of Clovis and the Franks, Columbanus and the Irish missionaries on the continent, German missionaries before Boniface, Boniface, the apostle of Germany, the pupils of Boniface, Willibald, Gregory of Utrecht, Sturm of Fulda, the conversion of the Saxons, Charlemagne and Alcuin, the Heliand and the Gospel Harmony, Scandinavian heathenism, the Christianization of Denmark, St. Ansgar, the Christianization of Sweden, the Christianization of Norway and Iceland, General Survey, Christian missions among the Wends, Cyrillus and Methodius, the apostles of the Slavs, Christianization of Moravia, Bohemian Poland, the conversion of the Bulgarians, the conversion of the Magyars, the Christianization of Russia, Mohammedanism in its relation to Christianity, literature, statistics, and chronology table position, Mohammedanism and Christian history, the home and the antecedents of Islam, life and character of Muhammad, the conquests of Islam, the Quran and the Bible, the Mohammedan religion, Mohammedan worship, Christian polemics against Mohammedanism, note on Mormonism, the papal hierarchy in the Holy Roman Empire, German general literature on the papacy, chronological table of the popes, anti-popes, and Roman emperors from Gregory I to Leo XIII, Gregory the Great, AD 590-604, Gregory and the Universal Episcopate, the writings of Gregory, the papacy from Gregory, Gregory II, AD 604-17, from Gregory to Zacharias, AD 715-741, alliance of the papacy with the new monarchy of the Franks, Pepin and the Patrimony of St. Peter, AD 741-755, Charles the Great, AD 768-814, founding of the Holy Roman Empire, AD 800, Charlemagne and Leo II, survey of the history of the Holy Roman Empire, the papacy and the empire from the death of Charlemagne to Nicholas I, AD 814-858, note on the myth of the Papist Joan II, the Pseudo-Isidorian decretals, Nicholas I, Hadrian II, the degradation of the papacy in the 10th century, the interference of Otho the Great, the second degradation of the papacy from Otho I to Henry III, 97 to 1046, Henry III in the Synod of Sutri, deposition of 3 rival popes, AD 1046. The conflict of the Eastern and Western churches and their separation, sources and literature, the consensus and dissensus between the Greek and Latin churches, the causes of separation, the Patriarch and the Pope, Photius, Nicholas, progress and completion of the schism, Cerularius II, fruitless attempts at reunion, morals and religion, literature, general character, medieval monks, clerical morals, domestic life, slavery, feuds, and private wars, the truce of God, the ordeal, the torture, Christian charity, monasticism, use of converts in the Middle Ages, St. Benedict, St. Nilus, St. Romuald, the convent of Cluny, church discipline, the penitential books, ecclesiastical punishments, excommunication, anathema, interdict, penance, and indulgence, church and state, legislation, the Roman law, the capitularies of Charlemagne, English legislature, worship and ceremonies, the Mass, the sermon, church poetry, Greek hymns and hymnists, Latin hymnody, literature, Latin hymns and hymnists, the seven sacraments, the organ and the bell, the worship of saints, the worship of images, literature, different theories, the iconoclastic war, and the Synod of 754, the restoration of image worship by the Seventh Ecumenical Council, 787, iconoclastic reaction and final triumph of image worship, 842, the Caroline books, and the Frankish Church on image worship, evangelical reformers, Agobardus of Lyons and Claudius of Turin. Doctrinal controversies, general survey, the controversy on the procession of the Holy Spirit, the arguments for and against the Philokae, the monotheletic controversy, the doctrine of two wills in Christ, history of monotheletism and diotheletism, the Sixth Ecumenical Council, AD 680, the heresy of honors, Concilium Quinsectum, AD 692, reaction of monothelitism, the Maronites, the adoptionist controversy, literature, history of adoptionism, doctrine of adoptionism, the predestinarian controversy, Gottschalk and Babinus Mars, Gottschalk and Hincmar, the contending theories on predestination, and the victory of semi-Augustinianism, the doctrine of Scotus Erigena, the Eucharistic controversy, literature, the two theories of the Lord's Supper, the theory of Pascasius Radbertus, the theory of Ratramnus, the Berenger controversy, Berenger's theory of the Lord's Supper, Lanfranc, and the triumph of transubstantiation, heretical sects, the Paulicians, the Euchites and other sects in the East, the new Manichaeans in the West, 524, the state of learning, literature, literary character of the early Middle Ages, learning in the Eastern Church, Christian Platonism and the pseudo-Dionysian writings, prevailing ignorance in the Western Church, educational efforts of the Church, patronage of letters by Charles the Great and Charles the Bald, Alfred the Great and education in England, biographical sketches of ecclesiastical writers, chronological list of the principal ecclesiastical writers from the 6th to the 12th century, St. Maximus the Confessor, John of Damascus, Photius, Patriarch of Constantinople, Simeon Metaphrastes, Ecumenius, Theophylact Michael Cellus, Euthemius Zigabenus, Eustathius of Thessalonica, Nicetas Acomenados, Cassiodorus, St. Gregory of Tours, St. Isidore of Seville, the Venerable Bede, Paul the Deacon, St. Paulinus of Aquileia, Alcuin, St. Liudger, Theodulf of Orleans, St. Eigil, Amalarius, Einhard, Smaragdus, Jonas of Orleans, Rabanus Maurus, Hamo, Walafrid Strabo, Florus Magister of Lyon, Servidus Lucas, Drathmar, St. Pascasius Robertus, Patramnus, Hincmar of Rheims, Johannes Scotius Erigena, Anastasius, Rutherius of Verona, Gerbert, Fulbert of Chartres, Rodolphus Glaber, Adam of Bremen, St. Peter Damiani. History of the Christian Church, Volume 5, The Middle Ages, Schaff's TOC. Well, that's good, reading aloud these notes. The Council of Constance, 1414, 1418, a special interest. The Council of Basel, 1431, 1449. The Council of Ferrara, Florence, 1438, 1445. Leaders of Catholic thought, literature, Occam, the decay of scholasticism. Catherine of Siena, the Saint. Peter de Ailly, ecclesiastical statesman. John Gerson, theologian and church leader. Nicholas of Clamanges, the moralist. Nicholas of Cusa, scholar and churchman. Popular preachers, the German mystics and literature, the new mysticism. Meister Eckhart, John Toller of Strasbourg. Henry Suso, the Friends of God. John of Rusbrock. Gerrit de Groot and the Brothers of the Common Life. The Imitation of Christ. Thomas à Kempis, the German theology. English mystics. Reformers before the Reformation, sources and literature, the Church in England in the 14th century, John Wycliffe, Wycliffe's teachings, Wycliffe and the Scriptures, the Lollard, John Huss of Bohemia, Huss of Constance, Jerome of Prague, the last popes of the Middle Ages, 1447, 152, page 152, literature and general survey, Nicholas V, Ennius Silvius de Piccolomini, Pius I, Paul II, Sixtus IV, 1471-1484, Innocent VIII, Pope Alexander the Sixth, Borgia, 1492-1503, Julius II, the warrior pope, 1503-1513, Leo X. Heresy and witchcraft, literature, heretical and unchurchly movements, witchcraft and its punishment, the Spanish Inquisition, the Renaissance, literature of the Renaissance, the intellectual awakening, Dante, Petrarca, Boccaccio, and patrons of classical studies in the 15th century, Greek teachers and Italian humanists, the artists, the revival of paganism, humanism in Germany, Reuchlin and Erasmus, humanism in France, humanism in England, the pulpit and popular piety literature, the clergy preaching doctrinal reformers, Girolamo Savonarola, the study and circulation of the Bible, popular piety works of charity, the sale of indulgences. End quoting of the table of contents. Taxation in relation to urbanization and political power allocation. Taxation levels seem to be a function of the form of a political authority and population lifestyle. Urban and rural areas present different trends in political form, coinciding with centralization and decentralization of political power historically. During the Roman Republic, taxation on urban centers could support public works that wealthy private citizens would not themselves be expected to afford. With the decline of primacy of urban centers after the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of the Merovingian Frankish kings of the 5th century in much Western Europe, political power became decentralized. Merovingian kings, becoming Christianized, expanded into Germany, afforded opportunities for evangelization and further conversion of pagan tribes to faith in the Lord. Merovingian kings and other conferred lands upon bishops of the church as well as upon retainers and allies. Over time, the benefactions and division of inherited lands among princes reduced their power. The conference of benefits, and allocation of resources are historical methods of gaining political power or holding on to it. A lesson of history seems to be that a ruling authority may actually decrease taxes upon subjects as the wealth and power of the authority increases. If the consolidation of wealth and power becomes absolute, taxes may drop to zero, as the authority directly is the owner of everything inclusive of the subjects. Conversely, in a free society, taxes may increase if a majority of a democracy view the allocation of resources away from concentrations of wealth toward pluralism as consistent with their principles of liberty. Yet urbanization tends to bring a populace toward conformity and a destruction of civil liberties found in rural social environments, while political parties experience a reductionism. Taxes, again, may rise or fall in relation to the distribution of wealth. Public taxation is, in effect, the allocation of resources by a ruling power. Ironically, Karl Marx described the expropriation of the expropriators that would exchange one form of autocracy for another. There may be a golden mean in taxation and liberty such that a rural society has minimal taxes required to support the few public works required. With few homeless and landless citizens and most able to meet their own needs, taxes would be low as the democratic society would have no need. Alternatively, urban societies are not at all self-sufficient and require mass importation of resources and allocation of wealth with farm-to-market roads importing supplies. Taxation is substantial if there is not to be concentration of wealth and commonality of poverty. Public debt increases to support the public sector may occur in order to forestall the experience of poverty for the masses in an urban society during a period of excess concentration of wealth. Globalization today is a form of treason against nationalism when advocated by politicians in the private sector. Global trading is all right, yet excess unconcern for the national well-being may bring about the demise of the well-being of the nation. In this period of the concentration of wealth, globalization of business, there is a protracted post-Reagan movement toward low taxes or even the same tax on the rich as the poor in order to stimulate the concentration of wealth. One would expect that as wealth is concentrated in the power of national democracy, given the orchiotomy of globalization, that taxation on the rich would drop to nil as when own everything as plutocrats. Christian foundation of Reformation and Renaissance. Christianity was important in founding the modern humanist movement. The discovery of the complete texts of Aristotle, introduced in the West through Spain, though also continuing from Byzantine Greek sources, stimulated the Aristotelian method of logic that was applied to Christian thought in the scholastic movement of the 12th century. Thomas Aquinas wrote the Summa Theologica with an Aristotelian method of proof and arguments, against culminating in a syllogistic conclusion or summe. A reaction against that approach by Petrarch and others whom preferred a Neoplatonic and Augustinian approach as being more relevant and central to human concerns on earth and their relationship to God. The politics of late Dark Ages Europe in relation to the Church and the relation of the Church to the Pope is fascinating reading. Going through the history of the Christian Church by Wilston Walker, Richard Norris, David Lotz, and Robert Handy, that was put together over a period of about a century, I learned many new insights regarding the complexity of movements of people and nations between the 11th and 15th centuries. Of course, there was a papal tax on subjects in far-flung states of Europe, as well as a schism between the eastern and western branches of the Church during part of the era. 2 patriarchs of the 5 patriarchs of the Nicene period still existed as powerful individuals. It was not to be a reunified church again until the Turks were about to take Constantinople, when the East sought military help that never arrived, yet that is another story. In the West, the papacy, for various reasons, became divided into 3. That is, 3 posts existed simultaneously, and all were fired or resigned under pressure of a general council of bishops from all over early in the 1430s. The bishops organized themselves into nations of 5 groups eventually to make voting simpler, though they were from more countries than that. Not only was the Church in need of reform, it required one leader subject to the General Council instead of a monarch levying taxes. For much of European history during the Dark Ages, a coevolution of political and national formation occurred along a trialectical, referred to C.S. Peirce, helix with the Church. Germany, or the Holy Roman Empire, didn't fare too well during this period, as the new pope, appointed by the Council of Constance, became too powerful again. The plague had hit Europe. Other matters concerned the locals. Germans had to pay high taxes to the pope. If the Reformation was in part a tax revolt during an era when the Roman pontiff tended toward corruption as one prince among 5 Italian principalities contesting for land and power, in a time when the prestige and power of the papacy declined, the Borgia popes were siring children, and Pope Julius II was leading his army in battle, the pre-formation and Renaissance were developing while vernacular translations of every useful document of antiquity, including the Bible, was proceeding. Walker or Lotz wrote in the text mentioned above that the source of Studia Humanitas was Petrarch. Interestingly, Marsilio Ficino, appointed by Cosimo de' Medici to lead the new Platonic Academy, developed a Platonic theology combining Christianity and Neoplatonism. I discovered that sympathetic concurrence for myself after reading the Enneads of Plotinus. Augustine was also a reader of Neoplatonism before becoming fully Christian. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, author of an oration on the dignity of man, was also a member of the Platonic Academy. Evidently, many of the founders of the humanist Renaissance were actually defending Christianity or renormalizing it in relation to the Aristotelian school of scholasticism. Of course, in recent decades, many American scholars have taken the opposite viewpoint, arguing that Aristotelianism and scholasticism, even Christianity, were in opposition to an entirely secular Renaissance providing a stimulus to science. Maybe Roger Bacon was considered a necromancer in this time for being a little eccentric in his experiments, yet that was the average upper-crust Brit for you. Science developed contemporaneously with the rest of the liberal arts or Studia Humanitas, though one might find some differences in the school curriculum of the first universities of Europe in Paris and Oxford, etc., that did have some Aristotelian subjects. That over time would split off from this applied secular sort of learning. Scientists have argued about the abstract reasoning of Aristotle's method versus the applied hands-on approach of experimenters. One might point out to the string and brain theorists who seem to have purely theoretical, almost Aristotelian math-based approaches to creating new scientific knowledge. Schaff regards Duns Scotus 1308 as the last of the scholastics. Schaff wrote that the scholastics had exhausted theological questions in the abstract. He wrote that Roger Bacon showed that many wanted to consider matters more real and capable of proof, in contrast to abstruse metaphysical questions. Modern post-Darwinian secularism has itself returned to an abstruse abstract metaphysics in the field of cosmology, having approached theoretical limits of observation. A 13.7 billion-year-old universe that appears to be accelerating with unknown or dark energy pushing space-time and matter apart is the paradigm in which membrane theory advanced from superstring and M theory, developed with abstract mathematical paradigms by Witten and others to theorize fundamental structures of physics. Like the unextended pre-dimensional one of the Neoplatonist Plotinus, singularity is an essential paradigm of observational physics and of the universe's logical origin of Einstein's general theory of relativity applied to the mass of the universe. Contemporary cosmology posits all material structures as phenomenal entanglements of energy in a steady state, broken pieces of energy from a coherent energy field, transcending yet containing matter. The atoms and strings are regarded as having decohered. They have broken symmetry, concepts not too different from Plotinus's paradigm of broken forms described in the Enneads. Even so, the examination of abstract, abstruse topics continues with the same fascination for physics as purely theological speculations had for the scholastics. If modern physics reaches toward understanding the universe before the Big Bang or inflaton, sometimes using models that require no singularity or that are eternally recurrent, such as vast space-time sheets colliding and stimulating a new round of energized expansion until running down, with entropy and time to be attracted to one another again for another collision, pulse, and rebound, others consider, like Bishop Berkeley, the universe as a holograph that simply appears to the human mind experience because human beings are immersed within the field of being themselves. These theories, though useful if they were to confirm belief in the creation of God of the universe, would yet require a certain faith of completeness within a paradigm that is implicitly uncertain. Uncertainty itself permits change in temporality. Only God is omniscient. I wanted to quote on a couple of points about William of Ockham that remain philosophically interesting. Volume 6, page 105, quote, "A characteristic feature of the scholasticism of Durandus and Ockham is the sharper distinction they made between reason and revelation. Following Duns Scotus, they declared that doctrines peculiar to revealed theology are not susceptible of proof by pure reason. The body of dogmatic truth as accepted by the Church they did not question. The third characteristic is the revival and ascendancy of nominalism. The principle Russellinus advocated more than 200 years before. The nominalists were also called terminists because they represent words as terms which do not necessarily have ideas and realities to correspond to them. A universal is simply a symbol or term for a number of things or for that which is common to a number of things," end quote. On political and ecclesiastical infallibility. Poor historical method applied to contemporary politics can lead to judgments based on faulty logic. Synthetic reason and the desire to exercise power leads to rash use of power and failure to have a better informed judgment of justice. In Schaff's Volume 6, he considers, quote, "the Middle Ages, the decline of the papacy and the preparation for modern Christianity, from Boniface VII, 8th to Martin Luther, AD 1294-1517, unquote. The decline of papal infallibility develops over time, and that appears naturally enough with the preceding period. With as many as 3 popes at once, not all of whom could be right in all things, and of general councils reigning in the power of popes, one wonders if the doctrine of infallibility wasn't something of a function correlating to actual political and ecclesiastical power of a particular pope. Joseph Stalin, too, was infallible in his own special way to the citizens of the Soviet Union, or at least dissenters had to be quiet about Stalin's errors lest they be taken to visit Beria's basement for a bullet in the head. Another cause for papal infallibility may have been pragmatist. One authorized and decisive opinion could stifle a babel of confusion. At some point within a productive cacophony of diverse opinion on theological issues, a resolution and conclusion may have been desirable. Res judicata stare decisis, the Pope, after listening to council of cardinals and otherwise ministers, had reached a verdict, in fact, an infallible opinion. Of course, it didn't work out that way. Always and for most of church history, there was competition for not only the role of sole primary oracle, but for leadership itself, such as the emperor or patriarch of the East councils and so forth. The Lord is right and true, yet every human errs. God's grace supervenes and brings history to the predetermined course, overcoming human tendencies toward failure. One may consider the problem of infallibility in power not only endemically a problem for the papacy, but as cause for schisms between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox, as well as the Protestant West. What ought to be a universal Christian church evolved within and without civilization, concurrently developing methods for resolving pluralism of opinions on politics Theology and political investiture on an ad hoc basis, often with conflict and occasionally with the perennial temporal solution of violence. Methods of resolving doctrinal differences and theories about the proper allocation of power may be illustrated with the metaphor of a non-self-correcting computer program without toleration for sectarian subroutines and without intrinsic parallel program management. Because of human infallibility, it is useful to regard select doctrinal differences that rise to become emergent sectarian divergence as subroutines within the greater Catholic concept of a universal church. I, of course, mean Catholic itself in a non-sectarian way here rather than in reference to Roman Catholicism. I would think the primary thing that ought to be excluded from doctrinal inclusion is acceptance of sin. The experience of the Middle Ages and the doctrine of infallibility held in regard to the attrition of heretics with the Inquisition ought to lead Christians toward a better understanding of the organizational challenges in keeping a universal Christian community together in spite of significant doctrinal differences. Obama administration efforts to consolidate every last bit of formerly Russian-Ukrainian land after the Cold War for the benefit of the West presents a kind of reverse sterility image to that of Trotsky's international communist imperial tendency that were repressed by Stalin and reemerged with Nikita Khrushchev. That is, one atheist leftist administration pursuing globalism follows another. What can the Russians think of that? It was the Christian moral guidance of the Reagan administration that had the charisma and desire to rid the world of nuclear weapons that coincided with the rise of Andropov's protege Mikhail Gorbachev to power in the final years of the Soviet Union that was an element of Christian grace enabling a peaceful transition to a post-Soviet Russia. Western leftists would, of course, attribute that entirely to President Gorbachev and deny that President Reagan's appeal to President Gorbachev in Berlin to tear down this wall or conventional weapons build-up had anything to do with it. The transition should have been one of subsequent non-exploitation of Russia. Traditional Russian lands, such as the eastern Ukraine, ought to have remained with Russia. Lands liberated from the Nazis, yet not Russian, should go independent. That was fairly simple and a premise that George Kennan would have agreed with. The atheist globalist movement toward a dehumanized, despiritualized West and a Ukraine given over to Chinese corporate farming, they signed a $10 billion farming deal, is a paradox. And yet, I could interpolate here 9 years after I wrote this that China is now supporting Russia in the war for Russia to retake some of its land seized by NATO expansion, fundamentally. Russia would be flanked by the Chinese infrastructure and perhaps have the Crimea become another Panama Canal zone run by the Chinese. The Chinese Communist Party did not throw in the towel and trust the kindness of foes. The Soviet Union did, and Russia is being made to suffer for that evident mistake in regard to the eastern Ukraine and the Crimea. One of Russia's major areas of food production is being usurped, lost in its food and physical security, threatened by globalists of insatiable greed, seeking to devour in the name of atheistic scientific development wherein human beings have no God-given inalienable rights. Instead, humanity would be managed as bits of flesh phenomenalities under the supervision of concentrated wealth and mengalas of advanced scientific inclination toward ethics, a personal egoist utilitarianism. Science is not endangered, humanity is. Science will be around learning and inventing things forever unless its technological progeny extirpate all human life on Earth, the ecosphere, or both. Pope Adrian I, the only British pope, sent Henry II of Britain the ring of investiture of Ireland and asked that the nation to be subdued and brought over to the Roman Church, though it had been the heart of the Celtic Catholic Church for centuries. Pope Adrian I ordered a tax upon every Irish home of 1 penny, a lot of money in the 12th century. Quoting Schaff on the topic from Volume 4, page 56, quote, "This papal Irish bull is not found in the Bullarium Romanum, the editors of which were ashamed of it, and it is denounced by some Irish Romanists as a monstrous and outrageous forgery, but it is given by Matthew Paris, 1155, was confirmed by Pope Alexander III in a letter to Henry II, 1172, died, deceased, published in Ireland in 1175, printed in Bronius, Annales ad AD, deceased 1159, who took his copy from a Codex Vaticanus and is acknowledged as undoubtedly genuine by Dr. Lanigan, the Roman Catholic historian of Ireland, Volume 4, 64, and other authorities. This is a very sophisticated international letter, yet one wherein two powerful nationals work together to take over another country. The Irish Celtic Church was phased out over time, yet the infrastructures of communication are remarkable for the practical effects, not only in Ireland, Britain, and Italy. And perhaps I have something else here. Elements of church reform: Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin. The Lollards, John Wycliffe, William Tyndale, John Huss, and the Hussites were advocates of reform before the Reformation. Wycliffe began his career of reformation in 1378. Wycliffe of Oxford was a well-educated academic who disagreed with the Fourth Lateran Council criterion for the Eucharist and the doctrine of literal transubstantiation. Wycliffe was called the morning star of the Reformation. He seemed to feel that a foreign papal demand for monies from England was inappropriate, though King John had agreed to pay tribute 33 years before. Wycliffe translated the Bible into English and said that it should take priority over worldly constructions of doctrine from the clergy. Huss was an advocate of Wycliffe's reform point of view and fell into an eventual condemnation by the Church. He believed the Catholic Church is independent of the papacy and priesthood, and that the ultramontanist view is wrong. The Pope and cardinals are not the Church. They do not have Peter's keys. Those are implicitly the property of people of faith who are the Church. Huss expressed his views in his major work, De Ecclesia. Huss was burned at the stake. Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin were 16th century reformers seeking a pious renormalization of Christian church to the Bible and away from worldly, biblically extraneous accretions to church practice. Each of the reformers had more than his share of worldly dangers and troubles, from establishment defenders of the concentrated social and political power and privilege of the Roman Church as from political loyalists and affiliates. Each reformer had friendships and fellow Christian collaborators working in the field of the Lord. Luther had his theologian friend Melanchthon. Zwingli had Bucer for moral support, and Calvin had Beza as successor to his evangelical work in Geneva, among others. Each of these men also took wives who were invaluable helpmates through their challenges from authority. That was quite a change from the sometimes nominal celibacy of the sacerdotal priesthood of the Roman Catholic Church of the era. Bringing the Bible into the church and reading it in the vernacular was quite a change from the liturgy of the Latin Mass, performed with much ceremony and with people accepting communion on their knees. Popularizing Christian church worship drew myriad to the Reformed services. One would wish that today the Church would recover the simple faith of the Reformers and further modernize the priesthood of believers, such that just 3 ranks of beginner, intermediate, and elder Christians would exist, with sharing of service roles and appropriate structures, and tithing conformed to the biblical level of 1%. 10% of harvest every third year, with the 10% divided in 3 parts, with a third of that going to non-working priests. Calvin mentioned in his answer to Bishop Sadolet that Bernard had thundered against Eugenius and all the bishops of his own age, citing even earlier need to reform the episcopal estate and papacy. It is interesting to consider how after nearly 500 years the ideas of Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, and the Roman Catholic Church have shaped Christian ideas about the salvation faith, the Eucharist, sacraments. Protestant reformers of the visible Christian Church made their reformed ideas at great personal cost, and the 30 Years' War of Liberation from Romanism and its subject princes tore the European peasantry. The American revolutionaries were of the Reformed school. George Washington, if Catholic, couldn't have revolted from his prince, although Britain had reduced Romanism already since Henry VIII. Values developed by Martin Luther in the 16th century Reformation stimulated political and ecclesiastical changes immediately. As the United States fails to maintain a strong Protestant religious ethic, it commensurately develops globalism, concentration of wealth through networking, and a variety of forms of ad hoc imperialism, with the collateral degradation of nationalism and democracy. Protests against the inhuman forces of impersonal hierarchical power in church and state are basic to the revolutionary esprit and direct relationship to the Lord Jesus Christ. Mankind finds freedom. Approximately half of the German princes took up the independence from Roman Catholicism movement right from the start. The first democracy in Europe, the Dutch democracy, led by the De Witt brothers in the 16th century. They were torn apart by the mob, incidentally. Severing ties from the Holy Roman Empire at Vienna was essential and just a first step in the rise of the age of democracy. All was not perfect in the Lutheran-style Reformation, though. Martin Luther was quite conservative and retained some Roman Catholic liturgical forms, although abolishing the exclusive priestly caste. When the hierarchy of corrupt bishops and priests was overthrown, Luther advocated and received support for Erastian transition. The German princes themselves became the religious leaders, appointing bishops for themselves. Frederick the Elector did follow Luther's instruction for making visitations to German districts to correct the corruptions made during the ineffective prior regime. The people were ready to receive the Word of God in a more egalitarian way, and German book publishing of the Bible skyrocketed from fewer than 100 books annually in the entire country to thousands and thousands of vernacular editions of the Bible. Mobs actually burned two of the first Catholic priests of Prussia that converted to the Reformed relationship to God that Luther set out. Anabaptists were persecuted by New Protestants, too, for abolishing infant baptism. Questions and controversies arose about infant baptism and of how much water needed to be used in any baptism were taken so seriously that many were put to death. That seems remarkable today, so I will toss in my own ideas on the topic of, do infants have original sin, and does baptism do them any good, since they have no ability to intentionally accept the Lord as their personal Savior through faith? It was pointed out that John the Baptist has awareness of God in the womb. Even so, John was born with original sin. I believe that original sin predominantly refers to the mortal context of being subject to entropy as a biological being. Hence, every human has original sin. The entropy condition was a reduction from the perfect environment of Eden and imposed to correct the errors of will of Adam and Eve. Infants have yet to develop consciousness sufficiently to choose willfully to do evil. They may all have a naturally sort of trust or faith as they are dependent on and reacting to others. Baptizing them may acknowledge that trust socially and can do no harm. Since parents are generally regarded as lawfully accountable for their charges, again, baptism can do no harm and may confer an element of grace upon the infant. If the infant grows to develop faith as an adult, then they may become born in the Spirit as saved souls. Jesus Christ is not bound to the legalisms of liturgical methods or theological positions such as humans entertain. Human beings need firewalls in the visible church to defend against interpretative error and union with the invisible church of Jesus Christ. I tend to believe in the Lutheran concept of salvation through faith, yet also have the Calvinist concept that election and predeterminism by God are correct. I also would think that the Eucharist is not a transubstantiation of the bread and wine into human blood or body, but rather something more like a commemoration and recognition of the fundamental elements of mass and energy as God's. The Eucharist would be an acknowledgement of the sovereignty of God in everything, analogous to an assertion of political sovereignty. It's a metaphysical statement on the ultimate building blocks of cosmology. Visible church outlets in the consumer era may be compared to franchise cheeseburger stores on Main Street. It may be true that McDonald's was the first vast franchise empire, although I kind of remember at the time that the A&W was around. Anyway, yet they do not have an exclusive formula to the one true cheeseburger. Even the faithful may wander into Burger King or Wendy's now and then. Also, there are home cheeseburger outlets relating directly to the true Platonic universal form of cheeseburger. Particular cheeseburgers are examples of forms of the universal partaking in the cheeseburger, acknowledging the organic earthly origin as grain from the earth in the Eucharist. The wine is the organic grapes of the earth. The Lord took the body of the earth, the organic bread, and human beings broke it on the cross, spilling his blood. Yet the salvation of the Lord given to mankind of faith transcends the world and its consumable produce. I would guess that the idea of relationships surpassing form is the fundamental reformist paradigm in the gestalt of the Church with the Lord. Liturgical forms and concepts about sacraments are a continuum of respect between Creator and created. That relationship continues to be significant even as salvation through faith rather than works or sacraments administered by a sacerdotal set-aside priestly caste has risen to the positive, better expression modality for Christians. Considering the transitions of human history from the end of the Roman Empire through the Dark Ages to the Protestant Reformation and beyond, the Inquisition to the current era where there is an enveloping global faithless drift towards sci-tech paradigms without moral concerns or deep contemplation of the Bible, it is useful to review select concepts of the Bible and Reformation. The priesthood of believers is a correct form rather than a partition dichotomy of priests and laity mirroring that of traditional aristocracy subject paradigms. Developing an active priesthood of believers church structure with just 3 ranks of beginner, intermediate, and elder would be a challenge and a renewal of Reformation. In the world today, the political drift is toward an ad hoc neo-imperialism class of wealth through global networks. Martin Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin were 3 important reformers of the Christian church. Luther, of a German Catholic monastic background who took a master's in doctorate in theology, came to represent opposition to the sale of indulgences and other practices not found in Scripture, and that seemed onerous and even conflicting with sound theology. If purgatory existed, then it would appear to nullify Christ's atoning sacrifice conditionally. The Roman Catholic Mass seemed to present the same problem of perennially re-sacrificing the Lord, if I understand that problem correctly. Luther became a professor at Frederick the Elector's new University of Wittenberg. It is there that Luther's theology instruction shown as a better way of reforming the recalcitrant papal establishment. Posting his 95 theses against indulgences prevalently on a church door in Wittenberg, the difficult process of protesting against church corruption was a stimulus for the rise of a Protestant Reformed church. Considering the role of the Christian church in bringing civilization to the pagan tribes of Western Europe over the course of several hundred years, it is not surprising that the church gained influence among the princely leaders of the various nations. Churchmen were also transnationals of the era. After the fall of Rome to the Goths were with an army of priests. Corruption in human social organizations, including the church, was of course the rule rather than the exception. With the Muslim forces of the Abbasid Caliphate attacking Spain, Sicily, and Byzantium, the church had a role that naturally developed as the faith of the invaded, resisting the theocratic war machine of Mohammedan votaries. With a millennium of defense military operations against Muslim forces, European nations increased their military skill. When the Byzantine Empire decreased in power due to the attacks by Muslims and Huns, the church at Rome naturally increased in power and influence. Of course, sacerdotal corruptions with concubinage and the huge problem of papal sales of indulgences, papers granting forgiveness of sins that brought gold to the Vatican from all over Europe grew as uncorrected problems of the Roman church leadership. Because some popes asserted unlimited power over all church and state affairs, a reformation was sought by the laity. Martin Luther in Germany and Zwingli in Switzerland led a rectification of the Christian church to return to Bible basics, that the Word of God is primary and that there is an egalitarian priesthood of believers. That Reformation, accepted by many princes and governments, became so controversial that wars eventually developed between the forces of the imperial emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire and reform-minded German princes. In Switzerland, Roman Catholic forces fought against Protestant districts. Prussians declared ecclesiastical independence, and the number of churches not subject to Roman papal authority increased. In some ways, the Orthodox Church of Russia was a spectator, although Field Marshal Suvorov later chased Napoleon around Europe. Public disputations and debates were a common way that political powers in Germany and Switzerland might hear both sides of theological issues between Protestant and Romanish movements in the day. Luther and Zwingli each participated in such events. With the close relation between church and state in the 18th century, princes and magistracies were able to order what form Reformed or Papish the local churches must take. When the episcopate of bishops under the Pope was found in Protestant Germany to be inaccurate in doctrine by select princes, the princes themselves replaced their roles, and Luther was directed to write a list of reforms for delegated of a prince to take on visitation that they might bring the freed from post-Catholic licentiousness in the absence of authority back to the fold of biblical truth. Protestant reformers in Germany and Switzerland developed new preachers and theologians who often were converted Roman Catholic priests to a better priesthood of believers format. Unfortunately, even the electronically technologically enabled modern era has failed to upgrade to a post-set-aside hierarchical ministry organization structure for the church.